We already learned how to use built-in pipes to validate incoming request data through query string or route parameters. So if I go to VS Code, in the last lecture we learned how to validate the data coming through query string using built-in pipes like default value pipe and parsent pipe. And we also learned how to validate the data coming through route parameter using a built-in pipe. In this case, we use this parseInt pipe. Now, as it turns out, it is easier to validate query strings and route parameters using built-in pipe. The reason is simple. With query string or route parameters, we send simple and small amount of data to the server. So built-in pipes are good for validating or transforming data which is attached to incoming requests through query string or route parameters. But how would you validate a request body which has a large object? For example, when we are making a post request to this URL to root URL/users, with the post request, we are also passing a user object in the request body. Now, in this user object, we have only 5 properties. But when we work in a real world application, there we might want to store as much data about the user as we can. So there we might also want to store the email of the user, the phone number of the user, the city of the user where the user lives, and many more details. And as this object grows, it becomes difficult to validate this object. Also, we need an effective way of validating the request body so that we do not create a resource on the server with some invalid data. For example, if we want to create a user data, we need to validate this user data before we store it on the server, before we insert it in a database table. Okay, for example, here if I don't pass a value for this name property and if I send the request, in that case also the post request will be sent to the server. This user will be created and it will not give us any error. But this name should be a mandatory property. If you don't provide a name, if the name is empty string, the server should consider this data as an invalid data and it should not create this user. Right. So if we try to validate the request body with built-in pipes, first of all, the code will become very cluttered. Then we also need a better way of validating the body because it can contain a value of other data types as well. So for example, let's say we also want to store the email of the user. Now, when we want to store the email of the user, we need to make sure that the email which the user has provided, it is a valid email address. In the same way, if we want to store the phone number of the user, then before we store the phone number in the database, we need to make sure that the phone number which the user has provided, it is a valid phone number. And same goes for password also. So for example, let's say the valid password will have at least 8 characters. So we need to perform that validation on the password which the user has provided. And if we want to enforce the numbers and characters in the password, for that also we will have to write some different validation. And writing this kind of validation logic is very difficult with existing built-in pipes. And that's why we might want to create our own custom pipe for such validation. So in this example, if we want to validate the request body which we are sending to this user endpoint in order to create a new user, before this body is received by the controller which is going to create this user, we want to validate the data which we are receiving for this user object. If the data is valid, then only we will send this data to the controller in order to create a new user. And we are going to do that by creating our own custom pipe. And in order to create a custom pipe, we need something known as DTOs. DTO stands for Data Transfer Object, and it is a simple class that is used to represent data that is being transferred between different layers of an application, such as the controllers, services, and repositories. DTOs are often used to decouple the different layers of application and to make the code more readable and maintainable. Now, I know this statement is a little bit confusing, so you will understand this when we will start implementing this DTO practically. Just remember that DTO is nothing but a TypeScript class. In that class, we specify the properties which we want to receive for a given request, and on those properties, we also set different types of validations so that the data which we will receive in the request body, we can validate that data using the DTO which we create. So let's go to VS Code, and here we are going to create a DTO for creating a new user. So for now, let me go ahead and let me close this user controller and this user service file. And inside this user folder, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it as DTOs. You can name this folder anything, but inside this folder, since we are going to store the DTOs, I'm calling it as DTOs. And inside this folder, we are going to keep all the DTOs related to user. And for now, let's go ahead and let's create a DTO. And this DTO we are creating for creating a user. So let me call it as create user. And since it is going to be a DTO, I'll say .dto. And inside this file, we are going to create a TypeScript class. So the extension of this file should be .ts. Okay, so we can have a different DTO for creating a user. We can have a different DTO for fetching a user. We can have a different DTO for updating or deleting a user. And that's why instead of calling this as user DTO.ts, I'm calling it as create user DTO.ts, because this DTO we will use only when we are creating a user. So as we learned, a DTO is nothing but a class. And let's give a name for this class. Let's call it create user DTO. And then we might want to use this class outside of this file. So I'm also going to export it. Now, when we are going to create a user, what details do we want? So if I open user service.ts, there, when we have created a list of users, there we are taking the ID of the user, name of the user, age of the user, gender, and is married. Now here, instead of age, let's say I want to take the email. Okay, and here also, let's set the property as email, which should be a type string. Okay, and to this, let's assign some string value for all these emails. Okay, let's save this file. So what I want is, in my DTO, I want to have ID, name, email, gender, and is married property. And here we have an error. So here also, let's change it to email of type string. All right. So inside this class, we are going to create those properties. So I want to have an ID property, which is going to be of type number. I want to have a name property, which is going to be of type string. I want to have a gender property, which is going to be of type string. I want to have email property, which is going to be of type string. And I want to have is married property, which is going to be of type Boolean. All right, so here we have created a DTO. We have created a DTO class with some properties. Now, when we are going to verify our request body, the user object which we are going to receive in the request body using this DTO, there we also want to check if the name has a string value or not, or if the name contains a valid value or not. It should not be an empty string. So that validation we need to do on this name property. Then this ID should always be a number. Okay. In the same way, this email should be a string value and it should be a valid email address. So all those validations we need to perform on these properties before we connect this DTO to the request body which we are going to receive for this request, for this create user request. Okay, and that validation we will perform in our next lecture. So in order to set those validation on these properties, we are going to use a third-party library called class validator.